Most people think debt is the problem. I do not. I think ignorance is the problem. Debt is just a tool. In the hands of a fool, it becomes fire in a dry house. In the hands of a disciplined operator, it becomes fuel. That is one of the oldest truths in capitalism, and it is also one of the least understood truths among ordinary people. I have spent most of my life around money, around balance sheets, around banks, around businesses, around leverage, and around the human emotions that money pulls to the surface. Fear, envy, shame, greed, pride, relief. Those emotions do more damage than the numbers themselves. The numbers only reveal what the emotions have already decided. The average person was trained to think about debt morally. Debt bad, cash good, pay everything off. Never owe anyone anything, sleep well. That sounds responsible. It can also keep a person financially average forever. I do not say that because I worship debt. I do not. I hate stupid debt. I hate consumer debt. I hate debt used to finance vanity, ego, or emotional weakness. I hate debt that turns a paycheck into a hostage note. I hate high-interest obligations attached to declining assets. I hate the sort of borrowing that lets people perform prosperity while making their future smaller. But I also know another truth. The wealthy do not avoid debt. They position it, they structure it, they calculate it. They use it to control assets, compress time, and let capital do work that labor alone could never do fast enough. That is the line most people never cross mentally. They think loans exist to help them consume. The wealthy know loans are most powerful when they help you acquire. That is the first distinction. Borrow for acquisition, never for ego. That sentence looks simple. It is not. It is the dividing line between using the banking system and being used by it. If a man borrows $50,000 to buy a luxury car that will be worth less every year, then the loan has chained him to a shrinking object. His cash flow moves one way, out of his pocket and into the lender's. The car may flatter him. It does not strengthen him. If another man borrows $50,000 as a down payment on a small cash-flowing property, or as controlled expansion capital for a real business with real margins, then the loan behaves very differently. Now cash flow can move back toward him. Now the asset can carry part of its own burden. Now time begins working differently. Same dollar, different intention, different outcome. That is why I do not ask first whether a person has debt. I ask what the debt controls. That is the only adult question. A man who borrows for consumption becomes smaller with every payment. A man who borrows for acquisition can become larger with every payment if the structure is right. The middle class is often taught to fear debt and therefore stays smaller than necessary. The foolish borrow recklessly and get destroyed. The informed borrow selectively and expand. That is the whole picture. Now, before you become excited by that sentence, let me say something even more important. Leverage magnifies discipline. It does not repair stupidity. The loan is not the genius. The operator matters more than the instrument. I have seen intelligent people destroyed by leverage because they misunderstood one thing. Leverage is not mainly about boldness. It is about control. If one interruption, one vacancy, one rate move, one market shift, or one refinancing problem can turn your structure from stable to panicked, then you do not have smart leverage. You have fragile leverage, and fragile leverage collapses the moment the weather changes. This is why the real question is never simply how much you can borrow. Banks answer that question from their side. They ask how much can this borrower probably pay before we are endangered. I care about a different question. How much can I carry while remaining calm if life turns unpleasant for a while? That is a superior question because it is a human question, not merely a statistical one. Over-leverage is what happens when a person confuses maximum qualification with intelligent structure. The bank says yes to $500,000, and the borrower concludes $500,000 must therefore be safe. Nonsense. The bank is protecting the bank. You need to protect yourself. Margin is what protects you. Margin is breathing room. Margin is the difference between income and obligations. Margin is what keeps a temporary problem from becoming a permanent scar. A person with strong cash flow, reserves, and modest leverage can survive volatility. A person with thin margin, floating debt, and no buffer is not investing. He is walking a tightrope in a windstorm. That is not courage. That is ego. I have always believed that a serious borrower should assume something will go wrong. Not because pessimism is wise in itself, because reality is irregular. A tenant leaves, a roof leaks, demand softens, rates move, customers delay, energy costs rise, regulation changes, health fails. A family member needs help. The world is very inventive in the ways it interrupts fragile plans. That is why a leveraged asset must do more than look good in a favorable spreadsheet. It must survive stress. I like fixed-rate debt for that reason. I like duration matched sensibly to the asset. I like reserves. I like income that can cover the obligation without heroic assumptions. I like situations where the asset itself helps feed the debt. I dislike anything that depends on perfect timing, permanent optimism, or a lender's endless generosity. Now let us talk about the true engine underneath all of this. Spread. This is one of those words the average person never learns, and because he never learns it, he stays financially emotional. Spread is not mystical. Spread is simply the difference between what your money costs and what your asset produces. If you borrow at 6% and the asset reliably returns 12%, you have a positive spread. If you borrow at 7% and the asset returns nothing or little, you have a negative spread. That is all. But that simple arithmetic decides whether you are building or subsidizing your own decline. I prefer not to ask whether a deal feels exciting. I ask what the spread is and whether it survives friction. That second part matters. The amateur calculates gross. The adult calculates net. Gross rent is not cash flow. Gross sales are not profit. Projected growth is not realized return. You must subtract taxes, maintenance, vacancy, insurance, repairs, management, friction. Reality lives in the subtraction. A deal with a smaller spread and durable cash flow may be far better than a deal with a dramatic projected spread resting on fragile assumptions. The public likes spikes. Wealth is built by consistency. That is true in business. That is true in debt. The most dangerous borrower is not the ignorant man who knows he is guessing. It is the half-informed man who thinks he has done math because he performed arithmetic on optimistic inputs. That is not analysis. That is wishful thinking with a calculator. Now, if you do understand spread, something very powerful becomes possible. The asset can begin funding the next asset. One controlled property produces positive cash flow. That cash flow is not consumed. It is accumulated, then redeployed into the next acquisition. Now the system is growing not only from your labor, but from the spread itself. That is the beginning of compounding through leverage. The ordinary person works harder to earn more. The informed person builds structures where the spread begins funding expansion. That compresses time. Without leverage, wealth is often linear. With sensible leverage and positive spread, wealth can become nonlinear. That is why the rich do not mainly ask, "How hard am I working?" They ask, "What is the cost of capital? What is the yield of the asset? And what happens to the gap over time?" Once you start thinking that way, you stop sounding like a consumer and start sounding like an allocator. That is a major psychological shift. Consumers ask, "Can I afford the monthly payment?" Investors ask, "What does the asset return annually after the real costs are faced?" Honestly, that one question changes everything. Now let us move to inflation, because inflation is where the public becomes most confused. Most people experience inflation as a slow punishment. Groceries rise, insurance rises, utilities rise, repairs rise, rents rise, medical costs rise. Everything keeps asking for more of the same paycheck. Meanwhile, the saver who followed all the polite advice and stacked cash in a low-yielding account discovers that the number in the account stayed the same while the life it could buy shrank. That is one of the cruelest lessons in modern finance. Cash can preserve optionality in the short run. Held carelessly for too long, it can quietly destroy purchasing power. The person feels safe while getting smaller. That is why I always say cash is a reserve, not an identity. The wealthy do not hate cash. They simply understand its job. Short-term liquidity, opportunity, protection, not long-term worship. Now here is where fixed-rate debt becomes far more interesting than the public realizes. If you borrow long-term at a fixed rate and use that money to control an appreciating or cash-producing asset, inflation can quietly help you. Your payment stays nominally fixed. The dollars you use to repay become weaker over time. If your asset rises with inflation, or its cash flow adjusts upward with inflation, then the real burden of the debt declines while the value of what you control rises. That is a beautiful asymmetry when done correctly. A 30-year fixed mortgage on a productive property in an inflationary environment can become easier to carry over time if the income rises and the debt does not. The average person experiences inflation as an enemy because he is long cash and short assets. The informed operator often experiences inflation very differently because he is long productive assets and short fixed nominal obligations. Same macro environment, different position, different result. But again, let me be clear. Inflation is not a parachute for stupidity. It does not rescue bad assets. It does not repair weak demand. It does not solve variable rate fragility. If the debt floats and rates rise, your margin can get strangled. If the asset lacks pricing power, inflation may not help enough. If the structure was sloppy, inflation can expose rather than heal. Structure always matters more than slogans. That is why I do not say debt is always good in inflation. I say properly structured debt on properly chosen assets can turn inflation from punishment into tailwind. That is a much more precise statement. Now let us talk about credit positioning, because once you understand debt and spread, the next question is access. There is a massive difference between asking a bank for money and having banks compete to lend to you. One position is weak, the other is powerful. Most people see credit as a score. I see it as borrowing capacity priced by reputation. A higher credit score is not merely a badge. It is lower cost capital. Lower cost capital widens spread. Wider spread improves growth. Everything connects. That is why paying on time matters. Not because a morality tale says you should be a good boy, because a single late payment can raise future borrowing cost, and future borrowing cost can weaken every later asset decision. Everything matters because everything is connected through the price of capital. Utilization matters, liquidity matters, income stability matters, documented ability matters, relationships with lenders matter. The person with cash reserves, stable history, low utilization, and prior successful asset management is seen very differently from the person who wants a loan because he needs relief. Banks love the first person because he looks safe and profitable. They dislike the second because he looks desperate and unpredictable. This is another brutal truth of finance. Capital chases calm. It avoids chaos. If you want better terms, become calmer on paper. The wealthy do not wait to need credit before preparing their credit profile. They prepare the profile first, so that when opportunity appears, action is fast and terms are favorable. That is the right order. Preparation before expansion, not expansion before preparation. And once you reach a certain level, something changes. The bank stops feeling like a gatekeeper and starts feeling like a fuel source. That is a major power shift. You are no longer begging for permission. You are negotiating structure. That is where serious borrowing begins. Now, we arrive at compounding, which is where this entire system either becomes extraordinary or collapses into mere sophistication theater. Most people who borrow never experience real compounding. They borrow into static assets, vanity assets, or low-quality ideas that need perfect conditions. They mistake control for compounding. Those are different things. Compounding requires reinvestment. Income must produce more income. Cash flow must become seed. The process must accelerate through repetition, not just through paper appreciation. That is why I like assets that throw off reliable cash. Cash-flowing real estate, scalable businesses with real margins, certain digital assets with durable economics, cash-producing enterprises. That is what allows the system to self-fund. One asset throws off positive spread. The spread is not consumed. It funds reserves, then future acquisition. The next asset joins. Then the next. That is how the bank finances expansion, while your labor becomes less central. The amateur consumes profits early. The professional reinvests profits until the machine becomes too strong to ignore. This is one of the biggest psychological divides in wealth building. A person gets a little success and immediately wants visible proof of it. The nicer car, the better apartment, the upgrade, the public statement. That is how early compounding gets murdered. Early lifestyle inflation is one of the great assassins of real wealth. If your asset throws off $1,000 a month and that $1,000 goes into your lifestyle, then the machine has not accelerated. It has been domesticated. If that $1,000 gets redeployed into the system, then the engine begins changing state. That is the difference. I have always believed that real wealth requires a period where you are willing to look less rich than you are becoming. That is emotionally difficult. It is also highly profitable. Now we reach the war that matters more than the math, the psychological war of debt, because a perfect spreadsheet in the hands of an unstable mind is still dangerous. Debt amplifies who you are. If you are disciplined, it can magnify discipline. If you are impulsive, it magnifies impulsiveness. If you are greedy, it magnifies greed. If you are fearful, it magnifies fear. Leverage does not forgive emotional weakness. That is why the real operator must become psychologically boring. No thrill around borrowing, no shame around borrowing, no ego around borrowing, no panic around volatility. Debt must become arithmetic, nothing more. The person who treats leverage like a drug will eventually overdose. The person who treats it like a system can become very powerful. This is why I dislike comparison so much in money. Comparison makes debt heavier. Someone else is scaling faster. Someone else owns more doors, more units, more businesses, more flow, more glamour. Fine. That tells you almost nothing useful. Maybe he is building something durable. Maybe he is building a bomb. You do focus on your structure, your margin, your spread, your reserves, your time horizon, your skill stack. Wealth is not a race, it is engineering. And engineers do not redesign a bridge in the middle of a storm because another engineer posted a shiny photo from somewhere else. They respect load, pressure, balance, and durability. That is what I want people to learn from debt, not excitement. Engineering now, as assets mature, something else becomes important. Knowing when to hold debt and when to kill it. Leverage is a phase, not a religion. That sentence matters because too many people become ideologues in finance. One man fears debt so much, he never uses it even when it would clearly help him build faster. Another becomes so enchanted with leverage that he treats permanent indebtedness as proof of sophistication. Both are childish. Context is everything. In the early phase, debt can compress time and accelerate ownership. Debt can be optimized, refinance, extend duration, improve terms, protect cash flow, widen spread. In the later phase, debt may become optional. The assets are stronger, the equity is larger, the cash flow is fatter, reserves are healthier. At that stage, the question becomes more nuanced. Does this debt still serve my spread? Does the piece of reducing it outweigh the opportunity cost of carrying it? If a fixed 3% loan sits beneath a strong asset in an inflationary environment, there may be no hurry to kill it. If a 9% obligation now exceeds what the asset reasonably earns, the math changes. Peace can be rational. Expansion can also be rational. This is why I despise rules shouted without context. The correct answer often depends on phase, not ideology. This is where financial maturity begins, not in repeating slogans, in asking which phase am I in. Now let us talk about diversification, because leverage plus concentration is how many promising empires die. The first asset works, the second works too. Confidence rises, then complacency whispers the most expensive sentence in finance. You figured it out. That sentence ruins people. If all your debt is tied to one city, one industry, one borrower type, one customer concentration, one funding source, one business model, or one macro assumption, then you are not strong. You are exposed. The exposure is simply not obvious, while the cycle loves you. Diversification is not owning everything. It is reducing correlated fragility. That means diversifying from strength, not from confusion. Master one lane first, then expand into adjacent lanes that reduce dependency rather than multiplying the same risk under different labels. Residential real estate plus a strong digital business. Dividend cash flow plus property cash flow. Different lenders, different maturities, different customer bases, different types of income, different skills. True diversification is not just assets, it is also knowledge. The wealthy are not only diversified in holdings, they are diversified in competence that matters when the world changes. Now, timing. The public is obsessed with timing markets. Should I wait? Are rates too high? Is the market overheated? Is now the top? Is now the bottom? I have no patience for that kind of theater. You cannot perfectly time markets. You can absolutely time your structure. That is what matters. If rates are high but fixed, and the spread still works, a deal can still be intelligent. If rates are low and the spread is weak, the deal can still be stupid. Low rates do not guarantee good investments. High rates do not eliminate opportunity. Spread decides viability. Preparation decides survivability. During expansion, foolish people become reckless. During peaks, disciplined people become selective. During contractions, prepared people move. That is the actual cycle logic. The person who waits for perfect certainty almost always does nothing. That is the most expensive strategy of all because inflation continues, time passes, and opportunity leaves without asking whether you felt emotionally ready. I would rather act on strong structure than wait for a headline to flatter me. That is how fortunes are often built, not by clairvoyance, by preparation. Now there is another level beyond leverage. It is system income. This is where true financial power. Stage one is labor income. You sell time for money. Stage two is asset income. Assets begin producing cash. Stage three is system income. Income flows through structures that do not require your physical presence every time money arrives. This is where real freedom starts becoming visible. A rental portfolio with management systems, a digital business with operating processes, licensing, recurring revenue software, media systems, scalable services, capital allocation itself. Now income begins separating from your direct bodily involvement. That is a different game entirely. This matters because there is always a ceiling on personal labor. No matter how disciplined you are, your body remains finite. System income is how you step beyond that ceiling. It is not enough to replace your salary. You want to reduce your dependence on your own physical output as the primary driver. That is where true leverage evolves into something calmer and more sovereign. Now let us go one step further. Financial sovereignty, this is beyond ordinary independence. Independence means your income covers your life. Sovereignty means your structure protects your freedom, even when the environment becomes hostile. That is a higher standard. It means your assets produce. Your debt is conservative or optional, your reserves are real, your income streams are diverse, your obligations are controlled, your life no longer needs permission from a lender, a boss, a lucky month, or a cooperative economy. That is where I want people to go, not merely into higher income, into sovereignty. At that point, debt is no longer necessary in the emotional sense. It is used only when strategically useful. That is power, to need nothing desperately and still choose selectively. That is a much higher form of financial life than simply making more money every year. Now here is the part the public almost never studies. The final bottleneck is identity, because behavior follows belief. If a person still thinks like someone who is perpetually broke, no amount of increased income will fully save him. He will still hoard wrongly, overspend performatively, fear intelligently structured risk, and seek validation through lifestyle, because his inner operating system remains unchanged. The broke identity asks, how do I survive this month? The wealth identity asks, how do I allocate capital to strengthen the next decade? That is an enormous difference. The wealthy are often calmer, not because they are morally superior, but because their structure changed their psychology, and their psychology then protected the structure. That feedback loop matters. So if you want to change your money life, you cannot only learn new formulas. You must become a person who can hold leverage, neutrally respect risk, ignore social performance, and stay patient longer than feels comfortable, because wealth compounds slowly and then suddenly. That sentence is so true, people keep repeating it until they stop hearing it. The slowly part is what filters the crowd. The suddenly part is what the crowd envies later. If you do not survive the slowly, you do not deserve the suddenly. That is how I see it. And when I step back and look at all of this together, one conclusion keeps returning. The bank is not the villain. Ignorance is debt is not the trap. Uneducated debt is cash is not safety. Unallocated cash can become slow erosion. Work is not the problem. A life built only on selling time is the problem. Status is not wealth. Status funded by liabilities is the problem. This is why I would summarize the whole thing in a few lines. Borrow for acquisition, never for ego. Protect margin like your life depends on it, because in many cases it does. Calculate spread, honestly let inflation work for you, not against you. Build the kind of credit profile that lowers your cost of capital. Deploy borrowed money only into assets that compound. Master the psychology so debt remains arithmetic instead of drama. Hold or kill debt according to phase, not according to slogans. Diversify the structure before success seduces you into concentration. Time your preparation, not the headlines. Build systems that outgrow your labor, and eventually aim not for flashy wealth, but for sovereignty. That is how you make the bank work for you, not by hating it, by understanding exactly what game it is playing, and then refusing to play your old role inside it. The average person spends a lifetime financing consumption and calling it life. The informed person finances expansion and calls that freedom. That is the difference. And once you see it clearly, you cannot unsee it.